group's research in this space over the last several years has really been focused on data-driven female soccer cleats. And so I'm really excited to share where we're at on this, and I think this is a really great group to share this work with. All right, so I want to take you back to 2023, the most recent Women's World Cup. Mainstream media did a pretty decent job of highlighting the impact that ACL injuries had on the game. It's estimated that about 25 athletes had to sit out of competition altogether, and then even more athletes sustained an ACL injury leading up to competition. However, if we fast forward to October 2025, just last month, this is a list of 15 professional female athletes that sustained some sort of soft tissue knee injury. And this is quite shocking. And here we are in the years leading up to the next World Cup in 2027. And unfortunately, this list will only continue to grow. So why is that? Well, these female athletes are at least 2 to 3 times more likely to sustain an ACL injury. And this is multifactorial. So there's anatomical, physiological, and biomechanical sex-based differences. However, as Greg was saying, some of these are non-modifiable. We can't do anything about them. But when it comes to the biomechanics, we may be able to intervene in our movement patterns. But this is easier said than done. So if we consider things like systemic neuromuscular fatigue, this can exacerbate injury risk. And this is where cleats become an interesting area to potentially intervene in our biomechanics. And existing cleats are interesting in that, so the interaction at the cleat ground surface is associated with these torsional injuries that we see when it comes to the ACL injury. However, the existing soccer footwear that's available on the market is predominantly designed and validated according to male athlete mechanics, and in so may impose excess traction for these female athletes. So I just want to take a minute to kind of highlight this sex and gender gap in footwear, and this kind of goes along with what Susan was saying earlier, and that female athletes really aren't receiving enough research. And when it comes to the marketing of these companies that are making these products, we see a lot of focus on male athletes and explosive movements, but we're not seeing the same efforts for female athletes and protective mechanisms. So when it comes to soccer, we can't just stop wearing cleats altogether. Cleats are necessary for this multi-axial resistance against the sport's surface, and it improves pivoting and acceleration. The traction that the cleats provide are modified by the stud length and shape. So common shapes that we see are bladed and elliptical, with bladed being the more aggressive one. And often designers will just pick what looks cool because at the end of the day, companies have to sell cleats. But the problem is that in excess, traction can ultimately result in these multiplanar injuries at both the ankle and the knee. So this often will manifest in the form of a non-contact ACL injury. And this is often called foot fixation, where athletes will have the sensation of their foot almost being left behind during these movements like landing, cutting, and stopping. So we set out to really understand these cleats. So we wanted to understand the stud parameters for reducing excess rotational traction in cleated footwear specifically for female athletes. So we knew we had to look at stud length, shape, and the configuration in order to develop and validate a female data-driven cleat. We knew we had to better understand knee loading behavior during lateral cutting, and we did so in our biomechanics facility. We also really had to better understand how these characteristics affect traction in the knee. So I just briefly wanted to show where this research was done. So this was in our Marcus Mariota Sports Performance Center at the University of Oregon. We brought athletes in to perform several cutting tasks where we would measure movement and forces of these athletes. And we would also measure pressure inside the shoe. Happy to speak more on that later. All right, so to examine stud length, we took the Nike Mercurial, which is a very common cleat for female athletes, and we shaved down the studs to 75%, 50%, and 25% of the original length. And what we found was that the 75 to 50% cleat provided the most protective knee mechanics. So this indicates that longer studs may lead to greater foot fixation and torsional injury risk, whereas shorter studs might not provide enough traction, resulting in those similar injury risk mechanics, as it's not enough traction to perform the necessary movements. Then if we consider stud shape, we also looked at fatigue and sex, as this parameter is a little bit more nuanced. So we looked at elliptical and bladed studs, and we found that the elliptical studs trended towards those more protective mechanics at the knee. Then we also saw that there was a greater injury risk post-fatigue, specifically in female athletes. And actually males displayed almost protective knee mechanics when fatigued, so they have quite a different response to fatigue. All right, so then we took to the drawing board, quite literally, but none of us are necessarily artists, and so we sketched out our ideal cleat from our background information. And we knew we wanted shorter studs as well as predominantly rounder studs. For our design goals, we had this idea to promote more of a forefoot strike. So one thing that we observed is these athletes will often lead into a very heavy heel strike into this lateral cut, and this actually increases the mechanical demand at the knee. So we had this idea to reduce the studs on the heel to kind of reduce this almost heel clipping phenomenon. Our second idea was to help immediately direct the center of pressure during contact to really help athletes transition from contact to push-off. So to do that, we implemented this pivot point in the forefoot around the MTP joint, which is that circle up there. And we also reduced the length of the studs on the lateral aspect of the cleat. Now, we have the skills and capabilities to test cleats, but we don't necessarily have the means to manufacture cleats. So that's where we teamed up with Puma to co-develop a cleat, created the mild and wild prototype, and the wild is a more extreme version of the mild. And we tested that against our control cleat, which is the market available cleat at the time. And what we found was that both prototypes reduced overall utilized traction, as well as improved knee mechanics, both pre and post fatigue. So that was super exciting for us to see. Additionally, the mild prototype reduced the overall mechanical demand at the knee. And perhaps most importantly, athletes actually preferred the wild prototype. So that was super important feedback to Puma when it comes to what athletes actually like wearing and what helps prevent ACL injuries. So where does that leave us now? We're currently in our final validation stage where we're testing prototype 2.0, where we took the best features of both the mild and wild prototype. We're also doing this assessment out on the field this time with wearable sensors, and this cleat or its next iteration will be available for the World Cup in 2027. So we're excited to hopefully have an impact here. With that, I'd like to thank my lab mates and thank you to the organizers for inviting me out today.